"We want you to be the bait," the detective said, placing photos of 3 dead women on the table. They had all corresponded with him, just like me. I'm 70 years old and I taught literature for 40 years, and now I was supposed to let a serial killer into my home, pretending to be his next victim. "We'll be at every window," he promised. But I knew that between him and me, there would only be the silence of my home and his knowledge of all my weaknesses. The clock on the dresser read 5:17 when Eleanor Vance realized she had been standing barefoot on the cold oak floor for several minutes. She couldn't remember getting out of bed, a troubling discovery in itself. Outside the bedroom window, the street was submerged in a pre-dawn darkness, pierced by a single streetlight whose yellowish glow fell directly on the metal mailbox by the road. The box was empty. Of course it was empty. The mail carrier didn't come until 10:30. Eleanor understood this perfectly well, and yet she kept watching. It was the "and yet" that bothered her. For 40 years she had arrived at her classroom at 8:30 sharp. She went to bed at 11 and rose at 6, never earlier. Her life was built on structure, like a bridge on its piers, and she saw nothing but reason in that. Insomnia was for people plagued by uncertainty, students before exams, lovers, debtors, not for 70-year-old widows with a pension and all their bills paid. Nevertheless, here she stood, her gaze fixed on the empty mailbox, a sentinel for a delivery that was hours away. Eleanor turned from the window, pulling on a cardigan and slipping her feet into slippers. She went down to the kitchen, deciding that coffee at this ungodly hour was a less humiliating activity than staring out at the empty street. By 9 o'clock, she was standing in the doorway of the library, a trash bag in her left hand and a pencil in her right. It was still Michael's library in her mind, a habit of thought that had finally stopped hurting 3 years ago. The room smelled of old paper and lemon wax, the same scent that had always been there, both with Michael and before him. Her method was simple: take each book, evaluate it, and make a decision. The sound and the fury stayed. They had read it aloud during long New England evenings, and Michael would recite the first line with the same relish every time, as if discovering it anew. A popular detective novel with a library sticker on its spine went into the bag. Michael had devoured it in one night, then declared, "The butler did it." The killer turned out to be the nephew. Eleanor had figured it out by the 3rd page, but had held her tongue. A collection of poems with a sentimental inscription from someone named Daniel also went into the bag. She couldn't recall any Daniel, and it was likely Michael hadn't either. Her hands, dusted with paper and ink, moved with a steady confidence. There was something calming in the system of it all. Take, assess, discard. Other people's thoughts, lives, and legacies, all submitting to classification. She was better at this than anything else, bringing order to the chaos of others. She tried not to think that her own life might also be in need of cataloging. Catherine Page burst through the open door without knocking, a formality she deemed unnecessary between neighbors of 20 years. She smelled of damp earth and some floral soap. "There you are. I peeked in the window and thought you weren't home." She glanced around. "So many books. Are you selling them?" "Some are going to the library," Eleanor said, nodding at the bag. "Have a seat if you like." "No, I just have a second." Catherine was already rummaging in her purse. "I just remembered I promised to show you this. Here, look." The flyer was trifolded and slightly crumpled, clearly having spent a few days in Catherine's bag. Glossy paper, bright letters, and a stock photo of hands holding a pen over paper. "Rehabilitation through Correspondence Program," it read, with the State Department of Corrections logo below. "They need educated volunteers," Catherine explained, folding her arms. "To write to inmates, for socialization or something. I immediately thought of you. You've spent your whole life teaching people to read and write." Eleanor took the flyer. The paper felt slick and unpleasantly cheap. Where did you get this? On the bulletin board at the pharmacy, Catherine said, already moving toward the door. Think about it, just for the heck of it. When her footsteps faded from the porch, Eleanor was left holding the flyer. The photo of the hands and pen looked staged. A slogan at the bottom proclaimed, "Words change people." It wasn't true. Words only changed people if you let them in. Most people didn't. She placed the flyer on the desk and returned to her books. That evening, the ticking of the clock grew especially distinct. Eleanor sat in her armchair with a novel by Thomas Mann on her lap, unable to read. The letters formed words, and the words formed sentences, but the meaning wouldn't stick. She'd finish a paragraph and realize she couldn't remember the beginning. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was 17. The house was quiet, not the peaceful quiet after a busy day, but the silence of a place long accustomed to having only one occupant. Eleanor knew the difference. She set the book aside and opened a desk drawer. The flyer lay on top. She hadn't tucked it away, which was symptomatic in itself. She smoothed it out on the polished wood. Cheap paper, a naive slogan, a staged photo. She read the program's terms twice. Anonymity was guaranteed. Inmates received only a volunteer's first name, no address. All correspondence was routed through the administration. It was the promise of a dialogue, even one through prison bars, with a person she knew nothing about that felt like something living. Vincent Cole's first 2 letters were meticulously dissected, a professional habit of hers, and she found absolutely nothing in them. The neat, blocky print on institutional paper described his daily routine and the weather he couldn't see from his barred window. His remarks on the prison library's books were neutral. Steinbeck was well-written. Hemingway used phrases that are too short. They were thoughts safe enough to be spoken in front of a guard. Eleanor's replies were just as guarded, describing the New England autumn and suggesting he read The Brothers Karamazov if he wished to understand faith. By the 3rd letter, she had all but decided the endeavor was a pointless waste of time. Catherine had meant well, but her idea of what might be interesting for a mind like Eleanor's was, to put it mildly, superficial. She was about to put the envelope aside and return to her book when her eyes caught the last line, a postscript, written in a script smaller than the main text. P.S. Rereading The Brothers Karamazov, I've always thought the true protagonist isn't Alyosha, but the stench from Father Zosima's corpse, which is the real test of faith for everyone. Eleanor read it once, then a second time, then a third, slowly, as if to confirm she wasn't imagining it. The thought was hers. Not a paraphrase, not a similar idea, but her own thought, jotted in the margin of her copy 30 years ago. In Michael's library, the old volume of Dostoevsky sat on the 3rd shelf from the left. Muscle memory, forged by years of working with books, led her straight to the page. There it was, her pencil markings, faded over 3 decades, barely legible. Zosima isn't the wisdom. He's the smell. The test for those who remain. She sank into the desk chair, not as a conscious act, but because her legs gave way. She held the book open, staring at her own handwriting with a feeling she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't surprise or alarm. It was something warmer. Recognition. A meeting. A response. It was as if she had dropped a stone into a dark well, expecting no answer, and had suddenly heard a splash. For the first time in 3 years, someone had truly seen her. Not as a widow, a retiree, or a quiet, intelligent teacher from a small town. They had seen her mind. The Thursday evening book club in Catherine Page's living room smelled of cinnamon and the dry heat of a well-stoked fire. The ladies were gathered around the coffee table. Catherine, Nancy Bartlett in her unchanging beige turtleneck, and Patricia Green with a notebook she never reread. They were discussing a popular, critically acclaimed novel. A strong woman, true feminism, so moving. Eleanor listened, a quiet, growing irritation building inside her. It wasn't that they were wrong, but they weren't reading, they were consuming. What about you, Eleanor? Nancy's smile was genuine but empty. It was neatly written, Eleanor said. Is that all? For its genre, that's sufficient. A brief silence fell. Catherine quickly offered cookies, and the conversation shifted to recipes. Eleanor held her teacup with both hands, not drinking. In that moment, she realized they seemed flat to her. Not unintelligent. Nancy was a notary. Patricia had worked in local government for 20 years. But two-dimensional. As if their thoughts existed only on the surface, with nothing underneath. A migraine, Eleanor announced, already rising. I do apologize. It came on so suddenly. Catherine looked at her with that particular mix of concern and insight that always preceded nosy questions. Eleanor didn't give her the chance. Coat, purse, a quick nod, and she was out on the street. The cool air hit her face. The leaves on the sidewalk smelled of damp earth and something bittersweetly autumnal. She walked home quickly, not because she was in a hurry, but because walking slowly forced her to think. She had lied. That was the first thing. She had left a book club she'd attended for 12 years because she could no longer pretend to be interested. The second conclusion was unavoidable. Her interest had found a new home. In a correspondence with a 34-year-old inmate whose education was limited to 2 years of a psychology degree. It was material for shame, and Eleanor catalogued it as such, placing it on a mental shelf alongside other unflattering things she knew about herself. Vincent's fourth letter lay on the desk. She was rereading it for the third time, not because she didn't understand, but because she was trying to pinpoint what bothered her. He had dissected her thoughts on Camus with surgical precision, agreeing in exactly the right places and objecting where an objection was the only honest response. It was perfect. She said the word perfect aloud, hearing how it sounded in the empty room. 4 months, 12 letters. Not a single error in tone. Not one judgment that grated against her own. For 40 years she had graded essays. Thousands of texts written by teenagers who thought they were thinking. She knew how to hear the voice behind the words, whether it was genuine or constructed. Vincent's letters were flawless, and that was precisely the problem. No one is flawless. Even the most brilliant conversationalists miss the mark sometimes. Henry might have made an ill-timed joke, agreed too hastily, or missed a nuance. No one hits the bullseye every time, except for people who aim very, very carefully. Her first impulse was to throw all the letters into the fireplace, to destroy this correspondence that, she now realized, had humiliated her more cunningly than she had understood. A 70-year-old former literature teacher, led by the nose by a manipulative inmate. But because it was her first impulse, she set it aside. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk, not the one with the letters, but an empty one next to it. She took out a new notebook with a black oilcloth cover she had bought last fall and never used. She opened it to the first page and picked up her fountain pen. Her handwriting flowed onto the paper, angular, elegant, without a single superfluous flourish. Case file, VC. She paused, tapping the pen against her teeth. Hypothesis. The subject doesn't respond. He reflects. Each letter is a calibrated mirror. Objective. To establish intellectual dependency by feigning unique understanding. Primary mechanism. Mirroring. Point of entry identified. The postscript about Dostoevsky, referencing my pencil notation in the 1974 edition. Question. How did the subject know about this notation? The clock read 11:15. Outside the bedroom window, the mailbox gleamed faintly under the streetlight. Eleanor Vance closed the notebook, slid it into the bottom drawer, and went to bed. Lying in the darkness, she didn't think about what to do next. She thought about how much time the subject had spent studying her before he wrote a single word. And that, she realized, was the question she should have asked from the very beginning. The knock was official. 3 raps, a pause, then 2 more. A rhythm that left no doubt about the visitor's profession. Eleanor set down her coffee cup, smoothed her hand over the already perfect tablecloth, and went to the door. The grandfather clock in the hall read 10:10. The man on the porch was in his 40s, maybe older, wearing a gray overcoat with a cardboard folder tucked under his arm. His face had a look of professional neutrality that couldn't hide a weariness born not just from this morning, but from years of similar mornings. Detective Paul Asher. He showed his badge. "Are you Eleanor Vance?" "Come in." In the dining room, he didn't sit until she offered, a gesture of politeness that Eleanor read as something else. A man accustomed to entering homes with bad news learns to take up as little space as possible. "You're acquainted with Vincent Cole." It wasn't a question. "We correspond through the rehabilitation program." "Yes." He opened the folder and laid 3 photographs on her dining table. They were glossy color prints of 3 women smiling at the camera with the casual ease of family snapshots. One wore a gardening hat, another stood by a Christmas tree, and the third was posed against the backdrop of a lake. Ordinary women: Anne-Marie DuPont, Catherine Riley, Laura Vance. His voice remained level. They all disappeared after their correspondence with Cole ended. Different years, different cities, same pattern. Eleanor looked from the 3 faces to Asher's. "Did you read their letters?" "Copies, yes." "You read them incorrectly." The words came out not with anger, but with a teacherly tone, like a correction to a student who had made a fundamental error in analysis. "You were looking for facts, dates, sums, addresses. You should have been looking for style, dynamics, shifts in tonality." Asher didn't argue. He just looked at her with an expression she didn't recognize at first. It wasn't skepticism or condescension. It was the look of a doctor at the bedside of a patient who knows the diagnosis, but also knows the patient hasn't accepted it yet. Eleanor Vance placed her glasses on the table. He had heard this before. Not these exact words, but this exact argument. "I'm not like the others. I see deeper. My case is different." He had heard it from women who were never seen again. The understanding pierced her, cold and precise as a needle. Asher gathered the photographs, sliding them back into the folder as neatly as he had removed them. "Cole is up for parole in the spring. The petition has already been filed." He turned a page. "We need you to continue the correspondence. Support the petition. When he gets out, we need you to invite him to your home." "You're asking me to be bait." "I'm offering you the only way to catch him before he starts his next project." A pause. 24-hour surveillance. We'll be at every window. No direct contact without backup." Eleanor stood and walked to the window. Outside it was November, the bare branches of the elm, a gray sky, Catherine's dark windowed house across the street. She pictured Vincent Cole sitting in Michael's armchair, his neat, blocky print, the handwriting of a man who leaves no trace, and the hands that held the pen as he wrote to her about Dostoevsky. Then she pictured something else. The woman in the gardening hat, receiving her first letter. A woman who didn't keep a second journal, who didn't have 40 years of practice reading the texts of others. The choice vanished. Only a duty remained. "When do you need my answer?" "Within a week." Asher picked up his hat from the chair. "There's one more thing. A woman I want you to see. Another one of Cole's correspondents, who is still alive. Her name? Linda Forrest. She lives in Havern, 25 minutes from here. He buttoned his coat. If you go, I'll drive. They drove in silence. Outside, the Vermont landscape unspooled in strips of russet and gray, the late autumn having stripped the trees of everything but the stark truth of their branches. Eleanor watched the road, her mind not empty, but focused inward. Havern was like Hollow Creek in the way one sad person resembles another, equally quiet, with the same bare maples lining the road. Linda Forrest's house was small, with white lace curtains and a pot of chrysanthemums by the porch. Inside, it smelled cloyingly sweet of vanilla air freshener and something older, dustier. The living room was cluttered with objects meant to fill a void: embroidered doilies, porcelain angels, photos of children and grandchildren in mismatched frames. On the coffee table sat a stack of letters tied with a faded pink ribbon. Linda Forrest was a small woman with an indistinct face, the kind that's hard to describe because it has spent a lifetime yielding to others. Her hands nervously fidgeted with the hem of her gray cardigan. "You want to know about Vincent?" She said his name carefully, like a word read over and over in private. "Tell us what you feel you can," Eleanor said. "He wrote so simply." A long pause. About ordinary things. How he loved when his mother baked apple pie. How he wished he could see snow again. She spoke slowly, as if each word had to be dredged up from a great depth. "I was living alone then, a year after Roy died. He understood what it meant to be alone. He wrote that he just wanted to sit by a fire with someone. Not even talking, just being near." "I believed him," Linda added quietly, her gaze falling on the ribbon-tied stack. "To this day, I don't understand how someone could do that." Asher pulled a thin sheaf of photocopies from his folder and placed it on the table in front of Eleanor. A few of the letters, with Linda's permission. Eleanor picked up the top sheet, the same neat, blocky print. At first, she felt a sharp, immediate sense of relief. The letters were simple, touchingly so. No references to Camus or Dostoevsky, no intellectual mirrors or finely calibrated paradoxes. Apple pie, snow, a quiet hearth. They had nothing in common with her correspondence. The thought came unbidden, sweet and almost imperceptible. He was different with me. He worked differently with me because I'm built differently. It wasn't that his words were a lie. It was that with Linda he had been pretending, but with her, he had been real. She set the letter down, then picked up the next one. Apple pie, snow, the fireplace. For Linda Forrest, this. For Eleanor Vance, Dostoevsky and Camus. The same man, the same result. A woman who cherishes a stack of letters tied with a pink ribbon, and a woman who opens a black notebook and writes, "Case file, VC," with a sense of intellectual superiority. Different forms of the same trap. Back in her car, Eleanor didn't speak. When the detective stopped in front of her house, she got out, nodded, and went inside. She drank a glass of water standing at the sink. That evening, she lit the lamp in the library and took out her second journal. Page after page, it laid out not an investigation, but a record of her own choices. A discrepancy in a date, dismissed as a typo. An identical phrase in 2 letters, rationalized as a quirk of his speech. A reaction to a reference that was somewhat excessive, reevaluate. She had noted it, and then she had done nothing. She had seen every sign, and every time she had chosen not to stop. The letters gave her something she craved. Not love, she was honest enough to admit that. But dialogue. A resonance. The feeling that her mind had finally met its match. It was a sensation so rare in her life, so perfectly fitted to the space Michael's death had left, that she had chosen to protect it, not to question it. She hadn't been deceived because Vincent Cole was some kind of genius. She had been deceived because she had collaborated, because she had preferred not to look. It wasn't just shame. It was the end of a certain comfortable idea of herself. The door to that idea had clicked shut with a quiet, final sound. The next morning, she called Asher. "I need to see Cole's mother, Alice Cole, in Burlington. Can you arrange it?" A pause. "Why?" "Because I need to know where it began," she rephrased. "Because before I make my final decision, I need the last piece." Asher didn't object. 2 days later, they were driving north, 2 hours on the interstate past Montpelier and beyond. Burlington was an anonymous cityscape of flat-faced apartment buildings and parking lots. Eleanor stared out the window, thinking that the farther she got from Hollow Creek, the less the world resembled what she had come to consider reality. Alice Cole's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a characterless building. Asher buzzed, and the long silence that followed was a message in itself. Alice Cole opened the door herself. She was a small, elderly woman with thin wrists and the movements of someone conserving energy for some unknown, important task. She led them into a room with bare walls, not just unadorned, but specifically empty. Faintly lighter rectangles on the wallpaper marked where frames had once hung. They had been intentionally removed. The apartment smelled of a chlorine-based cleaner, aggressive and thorough, the scent of a place being cleansed of something other than dirt. Alice Cole didn't offer tea. She just sat across from them and waited. "I've been corresponding with your son," Eleanor said. "I know." Her voice was as dry as paper. "I want to understand how he's put together." Alice was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed somewhere past Eleanor, on one of the light rectangles on the wall. "He always knew what you wanted to hear," she said at last. "Ever since he was a child. I thought it was sensitivity. His teachers called it empathy. Then I realized it wasn't the same thing. What is it?" Alice Cole looked directly at Eleanor for the first time, her expression unreadable and weary. "He doesn't know where what he reads in others ends, and where he himself begins." The silence in the apartment was ringing. The words landed not as a revelation, but as confirmation of a hypothesis Eleanor had already formed, but had been afraid to accept as proven. He wasn't a person. He was an instrument, so finely calibrated to the desires of others that it had no content of its own. Or perhaps it never had. As she was leaving, Alice added quietly, to no one in particular, "I took down all the pictures 3 years ago. It's easier this way." Eleanor drove home alone. At home, she sat in the dark for 2 hours, maybe 3. The final piece fell into place. The 3 women from the glossy photographs. Linda Forrest with her pink ribbon. Alice Cole and the empty rectangles on her walls. Her own journal, with its 17 entries she had chosen not to read to their conclusion. It all formed a single, clear picture that required no speculation. She picked up the phone and dialed Asher's number. "This is Vance." She paused. "I'll support the petition. I'll let him in the house." A silence. "You understand what you're doing?" Asher asked. "Better than you think," Eleanor replied. She hung up, walked to her desk, and took out the black notebook. On the first page it read, "Case File, VC." It was no longer an investigation. It was becoming a manuscript. The manuscript lay on the bed. Eleanor ran her fingertips over the cover, the rough cardboard heavy with 300 pages. Letters from a Predator, An Anatomy of Manipulation. She had chosen the title with precision. Anatomy was the right word. She had dissected him, layer by layer. The clock read 6 o'clock. Vincent Cole was due to arrive in an hour. At 6:15, she picked up the rotary phone and called Asher. The subject arrives at 7. We'll be in position at 6:30. His voice was a dry, working tone. Stick to the plan. If you're in danger, say Camus. That's the signal. Understood. Vance. Yes. A pause. He started to say something, then didn't. She heard him exhale. See you in the morning. She hung up. A general who has given her final order. The pieces were set. All she had to do was play her part to the end. At 7 o'clock sharp, there were 3 quiet, polite knocks at the door. On the threshold stood a man of average height in a simple dark coat. His features were regular, unmemorable, exactly as she'd expected. He held a bottle of wine from a local Vermont producer, a choice that was delicate enough to suggest taste, but modest enough not to seem like an attempt to impress. Mrs. Vance. His voice was soft and even. It's an honor to finally meet you in person. Come in. He hung his coat on a hook in the entryway, taking just enough liberty not to overstep. In the living room, he stood by the bookshelves, his posture a study in polite curiosity. Dostoevsky next to Camus, he said, not turning around. You arrange by dialogue, not alphabetically. I arrange them by conceptual pairs, Eleanor replied. Please sit. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Over dinner he spoke well, with a precision that showed true familiarity with the texts. Camus tells us something uncomfortable, Vincent said, tilting his head slightly. The form of grief is more important than its content. Society judges us not for the act, but for the incorrect affect. That's not a discovery, Eleanor said. It's a banality elevated to the level of tragedy. He paused just long enough to create the illusion of thought. You're right. That's why The Stranger is a great novel. It makes the banal unbearable. The conversation was proceeding exactly as she had predicted. Pattern number 4 in her manuscript. Agreement as a form of flattery. She watched, recorded, barely touching her food. The question about Michael came between the main course and dessert. Eleanor, if you don't mind. He used her first name for the first time, another calculated move. What book did your husband love to read aloud to you? The question aimed not at grief, but at nostalgia, at the warmth of a shared memory. We both loved Faulkner, she said evenly. But he had a habit of skipping the long descriptions. It irritated me. It was a truthful answer, and therefore gave him nothing. A micro-movement at the corner of his mouth was the only sign. This approach has failed. Switch tactics. By 11, she had shown him to the guest room. In her own bedroom, she lay in the dark, her eyes open. The evening had followed her script perfectly. She had seen every move, every feint. She felt calm. Too calm. When certainty becomes absolute, it's not a sign of correctness. It's a sign of a blind spot. The creak came around 2 in the morning. Not the familiar creak of the floorboard by the sink, but another from the hallway. A light, controlled sound, barely audible in the quiet house. The sound of someone who knew how to move silently and was doing so with conscious effort. Eleanor lay motionless. Her heart didn't race. It paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed its steady beat. She listened. The footsteps were moving toward the library. She rose from the bed without haste, a lifetime of discipline ingrained in her movements, and slipped on her cardigan before stepping into the hall. Vincent Cole looked at the folder, at the rubber band, at the angular, legible letters on the title page, visible through the thin vellum. His name. The smile didn't vanish from his face at once, but faded slowly, like diminishing light. It wasn't replaced by fear or anger, but by something else Eleanor had never seen in him: uncertainty. A blank space where a ready answer usually stood. He lifted his gaze, and in that moment she saw what Alice Cole had been trying to explain in her sterile Burlington apartment.